There is a single book, in a single library, in a city in northern Italy that most people alive today have never heard of, and most people will never visit in their lifetime. The library is called the Cathedral Chapter Library of Vercelli. The city of Vercelli sits in the flat plains of Piedmont, 50 miles east of Turin. Nothing about it announces itself as the kind of place where history-changing secrets are stored. There is no Vatican here. There is no famous monastery carved into a cliff. There is only a cathedral, and inside the cathedral, a library, and inside the library, a Latin manuscript copied sometime between the 6th and 7th century after Christ. One codex, one book. Sitting in the archive of a regional Italian cathedral that the world largely forgot about. And inside that manuscript is a story the institutional church declared forbidden, condemned by name in an official document, carried through the centuries by a tradition that refused to copy it, survived in this single physical copy and no other. A story about a dog given a human voice who stood before a Roman crowd and delivered a message on behalf of the Apostle Peter. A story about a 7-month-old infant who received the voice of a grown adult and used it to rebuke a magician before a stunned audience. A story about a man who rose into the air above the streets of Rome and then fell. And a story about an apostle who made one final request before his execution, that they turn the cross upside down, and then, from that upside-down cross, delivered the most extraordinary speech in the literature of the early church. That apostle is Peter, the first apostle, the rock, the man Jesus named as the foundation of the church. And what you are about to discover in this video is that everything the Christian tradition has believed about how Peter died, where Peter was, and what Peter said in his final hours, none of it comes from the canonical Bible. It comes from this book, from a text the institutional church declared spurious and quietly stopped copying, from a manuscript that survived because a single Latin copy ended up in one archive in one Italian city, where no one thought to look for it and no one ordered it destroyed. Just left. Just forgotten. If you have ever read the canonical book of Acts and felt that the story cut away too early, that something important was missing from the end, you were not wrong. The story did cut away, and what came after the cut was hidden from you. Now let's talk about the gap. The canonical Acts of the Apostles ends at chapter 28, verses 30 and 31. Paul is in Rome. He is under house arrest. He has been preaching the kingdom of God to everyone who comes to see him, with all boldness and without hindrance. That is the final sentence. That is where the narrative stops. The text offers nothing beyond that moment. No account of Peter arriving in Rome. No account of Simon Magus, who had traveled from Samaria to Rome and seduced the entire Roman Christian community away from the faith. No account of how Peter died. No account of the manner of his execution. No account of the words he spoke in his last hours. 2,000 years of Christian tradition rest on events the canonical scripture never bothered to record. The silence is not an accident. It is a gap with a shape. It begins at Acts chapter 28, verse 31, and it never closes. And in that gap, for nearly 19 centuries, there was a book that told you exactly what happened next. Before we get to what that book reveals, understand who Simon Magus was in the canonical text and why he matters. He appears in canonical Acts at chapter 8, verses 9 through 24. He is a Samaritan wonder-worker from the village of Gitta. He had amazed the entire nation of Samaria, declaring himself to be somebody great. The people of Samaria gave him the title the power of God, which is called great. He converted to the faith. He was baptized. Then he walked up to Peter and John and offered them money, actual money, a cash payment, in exchange for the ability to grant the Holy Spirit to people. Peter's response is recorded in the text word for word. "Your silver perish with you, because you thought you could obtain the gift of God with money." That is the last canonical mention of Simon Magus. Acts chapter 8, verse 24. Rebuked. Sent away. The canonical scripture does not record what Simon Magus did after that. But by the time Justin Martyr wrote his first apology, in approximately 155 AD, Simon Magus had traveled to Rome and was reportedly being venerated there as a god. By the time Irenaeus wrote Against Heresies, in approximately 180 AD, Simon Magus was being identified as the founding figure of the entire Gnostic heresy movement. The canonical text rebuffed him and then went silent. The forbidden text picks up exactly where the silence begins. The book is called the Acts of Peter. Its Latin title is Actus Petri cum Simone, the Act of Peter with Simon. It was composed in the 2nd century, in Greek, most likely somewhere in Asia Minor, between approximately 180 and 190 AD. The dating is significant. The year 180 AD places this text within the lifetime of people who could have spoken directly with those who remembered the apostolic generation. This is not a medieval invention. This is a 2nd century document, written while the memory of Peter's generation was still traceable through living human chains of testimony. According to Wilhelm Schneemelke, professor of New Testament studies at the University of Bonn and the editor of the standard scholarly reference New Testament Apocrypha, published in 1992, the Acts of Peter is the earliest surviving source for 3 events that Christian tradition has treated as settled historical knowledge for 2,000 years. First, Peter's mission in Rome. Second, the Quo Vadis encounter on the road outside the city walls. Third, Peter's crucifixion upside down on a cross, the earliest source, not the Gospels, not Paul's letters, not the canonical Acts of the Apostles, this book. The book that the institutional church condemned by name, stopped copying, and left in one archive in northern Italy until it was the only copy remaining. A 9th century document known as the Stichometry of Nicephorus, attributed to Patriarch Nicephorus of Constantinople, who died in 828 AD, records that the Acts of Peter originally measured 2,750 lines. The manuscript preserved in Vercelli represents approximately 2/3 of that original length. At least 1/3 of the text is permanently gone. What those missing lines contained, no one knows. They had already disappeared before the Vercelli Codex was copied in the 6th or 7th century. What remains is enough to change everything you thought you knew about the 1st century of the Church in Rome. What remains contains a talking dog and a talking infant, and a man falling from the sky. What remains contains the first written account of how Peter died, why he asked to die the way he did, and what he said while he was dying. What remains is the text from which 2 billion Christians inherited the image of Peter on an upside-down cross, an image so fundamental to Christian tradition that it appears on the papal seal, in cathedral paintings across 5 centuries of European art, in the names of churches from Rome to the edges of the ancient world. And all of it was hidden from you. Before we go further into what this text actually says, and what it reveals about the first generation of Christians in Rome, if this kind of history matters to you, if finding what was buried in the version of the story that was handed down to you is why you are here, subscribe to this channel right now and activate the bell. Every week on this channel, we go into the texts they condemned. Every week we find what was removed from the account you were given. This community is growing because more and more people are realizing that the history they were taught has deliberate gaps in it, and those gaps are not empty. They were hidden, and they are being opened. Subscribe now. Do not miss what comes next. What comes next is the part of this story they worked the hardest to keep buried. The text that survives in Vercelli is not the original. The author of the Acts of Peter wrote in Greek. The Greek is gone. What came through the centuries is a Latin translation, copied by a scribe working somewhere between the 6th and 7th century after Christ, made from an earlier Latin version that was itself derived from a Greek manuscript that no longer exists. What makes the Acts of Peter unusual is how few copies were made. The Latin tradition yielded one surviving manuscript. One, which means that if the cathedral chapter library of Vercelli had been lost to fire or flood or war at any point in the last 14 centuries, the main text of this story would be gone entirely, and no one alive today would know it had existed as a complete narrative. But the Vercelli Codex is not entirely alone. 3 independent witnesses survive, and together they confirm that the Acts of Peter was once far more widely read and copied than a single Latin manuscript suggests. The first is the Berlin Codex. Its official catalogue designation is Papyrus Berlinensis 8502. It is a papyrus manuscript written in Sahidic Coptic, the ancient Egyptian Christian dialect, dated to the late 4th or early 5th century after Christ. It was purchased in Cairo in January 1896 by a German diplomat named Karl Reinhardt, who brought it to Berlin. A complete scholarly edition was not published until 1955, nearly 60 years after its purchase, when Walter Till produced the first full academic text. What the Berlin Codex contains alongside the Gospel of Mary Magdalene and the Apocryphon of John is a fragment of the Acts of Peter that does not appear in the Vercelli text at all. It is a separate episode, the story of Peter's paralyzed daughter, an account that the Latin tradition had already lost. Egyptian Christians were reading a version of this story in their own language, in a manuscript that predates the Vercelli Codex by centuries, and they were reading a chapter the Latin world had already forgotten. The second witness is Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 849, a Greek fragment preserving a healing miracle from the Acts of Peter in the original language of composition. It confirms that the text circulated in Greek across the ancient Mediterranean, and that readers were copying individual episodes from it rather than preserving it as a complete narrative. The third witness is the most telling. Chapters 30 through 41 of the Vercelli text, the martyrdom of Peter, covering the Quo Vadis encounter and the upside-down crucifixion, were copied separately in both Greek and Coptic by communities that preserved nothing else from the text. The full narrative was being left behind, but those final chapters were being extracted and kept alive on their own. People who would not copy the complete condemned book still found ways to hold on to how Peter died. That tells you something about what those final chapters meant to early Christians, and why the institution wanted the entire book to disappear. Wilhelm Schneemelke, professor of New Testament studies at the University of Bonn and editor of the standard academic reference New Testament Apocrypha, published in 1992, established the text within the landscape of second-century Christian literature. Christine Thomas, whose study, The Acts of Peter, Gospel Literature, and the Ancient Novel, was published by Oxford University Press in 2003, demonstrated that the Acts of Peter was a deliberately constructed narrative, not a simple collection of legends, one that operated within the conventions of Greco-Roman romance, a genre that educated readers of the 2nd century would have recognized immediately. These manuscripts did not survive because the medieval church was trying to protect them. They survived in spite of the institutional decision to condemn them. The Coptic communities of Egypt copied the Berlin fragment in the 4th century. The Latin translator produced the Vercelli version before the 6th. The communities who loved the martyrdom section went on copying those final chapters long after the rest of the book was being abandoned. Now, who was Simon Magus by the time the Acts of Peter opens, and what had he already done to the Roman Christian community? Chapter 1 established him from canonical Acts, the Samaritan wonder-worker from Gitta, rebuked by Peter at Acts chapter 8, verse 24, and dismissed from the New Testament at that same verse. But the man who disappears from Scripture does not disappear from history. Justin Martyr, writing his first apology in approximately 155 AD, stated that Simon Magus had come to Rome during the reign of the Emperor Claudius and been venerated there as a god, that nearly all the Samaritans honored him, and that his influence had spread to people of other nations. Irenaeus of Leon, writing against heresies in approximately 180 AD, identified Simon Magus as the root from which every heresy that troubled the early church had grown. He called him the father of the heretics. By the time the Acts of Peter was being written, approximately 180 to 190 AD, the early church was arguing that every false teaching traced its lineage back to this one man. By the time the Acts of Peter opens, Simon has been in Rome for years. He has performed signs. He has taught. He has given the Roman Christian community a version of spiritual power that was persuasive enough and visible enough that they chose it over everything Peter represented. The text describes the community as having fallen away wholesale. All of them. The foundation of the church in Rome had been pulled out from under the building before Peter even arrived. The Acts of Peter opens at the moment Paul is still in Rome, still under house arrest, preparing to fulfill the intention he stated in his letter to the Romans at chapter 15, verses 24 and 28, to travel to Spain after passing through Rome. Paul departs. The text records his sailing. Schneemelcher notes that the opening chapters describing Paul's final days in Rome may be a later addition, stitched in to connect the Acts of Peter to the canonical Acts of the Apostles. The question of interpolation has not been fully resolved, but whether those chapters were always there or were added to anchor the story to a known timeline, what happens next is the same. Paul sails, and with his departure, the Roman community is left alone with Simon Magus. A vision came to Peter in Caesarea Maritima, the great port city on the Mediterranean coast of Judea, the administrative center of Roman power in the east, the gateway between the eastern provinces and the sea routes west. The vision commanded him to go to Rome, to confront Simon, to bring back what had been taken. Peter obeyed. He crossed the sea in 12 days. The Roman Christians who had followed Simon were ashamed to return. That is the condition the text records when Peter arrived. Ashamed. They had watched Simon's signs and decided he was the greater power, and now Peter was in the harbor of the city, and the people who should have welcomed him could not look him in the eye. Peter had not come as a visitor. The text frames what follows as a contest. Before we get to that contest, before we get to what happened when Peter and Simon Magus finally stood in the same room in Rome, I want to ask you something. From where are you watching this video right now? Write your country or your city in the comments below. This community is global and it is growing, and I want to know where you are. Write it down. Stay with me. Because what comes next is the part of this story that gave this video its title. Peter had not been in Rome long when he performed the first miracle. The text does not describe it as an act of great ceremony. Peter took a smoked herring from a window. That is the description in the Acts of Peter, according to Schneemelke's New Testament Apocrypha at page 292. A smoked fish, the kind of preserved, salted, dried thing you would find hanging in a market stall or stored on a shelf. Not a live creature. Not something with a heartbeat that had gone still. A processed object, dead and dried and cured. Something that had been dead long enough to be made into food. Peter had it placed in a pool of water. The fish came back to life and swam. This is not a healing. This is not an exorcism. What the Acts of Peter describes is a reversal of death applied to something that was not alive in any human or animal sense. The fish was not sick. It was smoked, cured, processed. Peter placed it in water, and it swam. The crowd that had been following Simon Magus watched this, and the crowd began to turn. Now, where was this crowd gathering, and who owned the house they were gathering in? His name was Marcellus. He was a senator of Rome. And before Simon Magus arrived, Marcellus had been known across the city for one thing. He gave. Widows, orphans, foreigners, the poor. The Acts of Peter, at chapter 8 in Schneemelke, page 286, describes Marcellus as a man who had opened his household and his resources to everyone who came to his door without means. That was his identity in Rome. That was the man he had been. Simon Magus had taken that man and turned him. Not subtly. The Acts of Peter presents Marcellus's conversion to Simon's following as a significant feature of Simon's Roman operation. A senator of Rome with that standing, that reputation, that house, was not a small endorsement. When Marcellus followed Simon, it told everyone else in the community that Simon was the power worth following. Then Peter arrived. Then the fish swam. Then the community began to move back toward what it had abandoned. And Marcellus, hearing what was being said about Peter's miracles, came to Peter himself. He repented. He placed his house at Peter's disposal. The building that had been Simon's Roman base became Peter's base. The same rooms, the same courtyard, the same threshold, but with a different man in authority over them. It was to that threshold that Peter came the day he loosed the chain. The Acts of Peter records the scene at chapters 12 and 13. Peter arrived at the house of Marcellus, where Simon Magus was still lodging. A large dog was bound outside with a strong chain, not a decorative animal, not a small thing, a large dog, chained. Peter loosened the chain. The text says what happened next, with the same directness it uses for everything. The dog received a man's voice. The animal, freed from the chain, turned toward Peter, and it spoke. Not in sounds, not in barks that might be interpreted as language. It spoke in the clear, full voice of a human man. And the first words it used with that voice are preserved in the Acts of Peter in direct quotation. From chapter 12 of the primary text, in the English translation, available through scholarly sources. What dost thou bid me to do, thou servant of the unspeakable and living God? Read that sentence again. This is what the dog said. It acknowledged Peter's authority. It identified the one Peter served, the unspeakable and living God. And it asked what Peter wanted it to do. The dog was not confused about what was happening. It was not frightened. It was waiting for instructions. Peter gave the dog his instructions. He commanded it to go inside the house, stand before Simon Magus, and deliver Peter's challenge to him directly, to tell Simon that Peter had come to Rome. that Peter was calling him to account in front of the assembled crowd, the dog walked into the house. The crowd was already gathered inside. They watched the dog enter. They watched it position itself in front of Simon Magus, and they heard it speak in a human voice. Peter's words, delivered by this animal that should not have been capable of forming a single syllable, spoken in front of everyone who had gathered to see what would happen when Peter and Simon finally stood in the same space. Simon could not respond. The man who had amazed the nation of Samaria, the man who had traveled to Rome and pulled an entire Christian community away from its foundation, the man whose name Justin Martyr and Irenaeus would write about as the origin of all false teaching in the early church. That man stood in a room in Rome, and a dog delivered a spoken challenge to him in front of a crowd, and he was frightened. He could not answer the animal. He could not face it. The crowd was watching the wonder worker be silenced by a chain-loosened dog that had received a borrowed voice for 30 minutes. Simon sent a reply back. He gave the dog words to carry back to Peter. The dog turned, left the room, crossed back to where Peter was standing outside, and delivered Simon's answer. Then the dog fell dead at Peter's feet. The Acts of Peter records this plainly. The dog had been given what it needed to do, and when the purpose was finished, the gift was withdrawn, and the animal died. The text gives no eulogies. It gives no elaboration. The dog served its function, and it died. That is all the text says, and somehow that plainness is the most striking detail of the whole scene. The author considered the dog's death as unremarkable as its speech. Both were simply what happened. This was not the last time in these chapters that a voice arrived in something that should not have been capable of using one. During a gathering at Marcellus's house, a 7-month-old infant was present. The Acts of Peter, chapter 15, Schnee Melcher, page 293, records what happened. The infant, a child 7 months old, who had not yet learned to speak, who had not yet formed sounds into words, received an adult man's voice. A fully articulate, fully formed, adult human voice, arriving in a 7-month-old body. And with that voice, the infant rebuked Simon Magus in front of the assembled crowd. If the talking dog is strange, this is stranger. A dog at least has a mouth and a voice box. It has the physical equipment for sound. A 7-month-old infant has vocal cords, but has not yet connected them to language. What the Acts of Peter describes is language arriving in a being that has not yet acquired it. The child delivered its message. The crowd heard it. Then the voice went away. The child became a 7-month-old again. It returned to its mother's breast and nursed. 2 borrowed voices in 2 creatures that should not have had them, both used to challenge and condemn Simon Magus before the community that had followed him. And alongside all of this, between the animal miracles and the public contest that was coming, the Acts of Peter levels one more charge against Simon. A wealthy Christian woman named Eubola had lost a large sum of gold. The Acts of Peter names her at chapter 17, Schneemelke, page 296, and the text attributes the theft to Simon Magus. He had taken gold from her house. This detail completes the portrait the text is building of Simon across these chapters. He had taken the faith of the Roman community. He had taken the loyalty of a senator. He had taken Eubola's gold. The Acts of Peter is not content to present Simon simply as a theological adversary with a competing claim to divine power. It presents him as a thief, a man who took things from people who trusted him. The crowd that had followed Simon was beginning to see clearly what they had been following. We are now at the midpoint of this story, And if you want to go deeper into what this text says, and what the Acts of Peter reveals about the first generation of Christians in Rome, I have prepared a full study ebook on this and the other texts this channel covers. You will find it in the pinned comment below this video. Download it now. It goes further than any single video can go, and it is there because you came here looking for the version of this history that was cut out of the account you were handed. This is what comes after the cut. Simon Magus understood what the miracles in Marcellus's house had done to his standing in Rome. A talking dog and a speaking infant and a fish that swam back to life had given the crowd a measuring stick. And Simon was no longer the longest one. He could not let the contest end there, not in a private house, not in front of the community that had already been moving back toward Peter before any of the signs were performed. Simon needed a public stage, a formal test, an event that Rome could not interpret as a neighborhood dispute between a Galilean apostle and a Samaritan wonder-worker. He needed something decisive, witnessed by the people whose witness carried weight. He called for a resurrection contest. The Acts of Peter records this confrontation at chapters 25 through 29, Schnee Melcher, pages 305 through 309. The setting was not Marcellus's house. The crowd that gathered now included Agrippa, the prefect of Rome, the senior Roman magistrate in the city, along with other officials and dignitaries whose presence transformed the event into something that mattered to the Roman power structure. This was not a miracle performed for believers already looking for a reason to return. This was a demonstration staged in front of the authority of Rome, with the authority of Rome watching. The terms were straightforward. A young man had died. Peter and Simon would each attempt to raise him. The one whose power was real would succeed. Simon went first. The dead man's head rose. The Acts of Peter is specific about this, and the script that tells this story has to be specific too. Simon's attempt was not nothing. The head of the dead man lifted from where the body lay, briefly, as though the whole body were about to follow it upward. The crowd saw it move. The prefect saw it move. Everyone in that space watched a dead man's head rise at Simon's command. That is what Simon could do, and in any other contest, against any other opponent, it might have been enough. A head moving on a dead body is a demonstration of power that very few people in Rome or anywhere else in the ancient world could match. But it did not continue. The head rose, and the rest of the body stayed where it was. Simon's attempt stopped exactly where a full resurrection would have kept going. The Acts of Peter calls the attempt incomplete. Incomplete is the exact word. Not failed, not fraudulent. Incomplete, as though the power began and was then met by something it could not overcome, and the result was a dead man with a briefly lifted head and no further movement. Peter stepped forward and raised the man fully in the name of Jesus Christ, not the head, not the upper body. The man rose. Completely. The crowd that had watched Simon's attempt see its limit, watched Peter pass that limit without stopping. The crowd did not need to deliberate about what they had witnessed. Now Simon had nothing left in the contest of miracles. But he had one demonstration left, and he chose to make it on the most visible stage in the world. He announced in public, before Nero, that he would ascend to God. He would fly. He would rise into the air above the city of Rome and prove, in the sky, in front of the emperor and the prefect and the assembled crowd of the Roman Forum, that his power was genuine and that Peter's victory in the resurrection contest was irrelevant. The Acts of Peter, at chapter 32, Schnee Melcher, page 310, records what happened. Simon Magus rose into the air above the Roman Forum. above the Via Sacra, the sacred road that ran through the heart of the city, the road down which Roman generals had marched in triumph, the road that was as close to the symbolic center of the empire as any single piece of ground could be. Simon rose above it. Nero was below him, watching. Agrippa was below him, watching. The crowd that had gathered in the forum was below him, watching. The man who had once astonished the nation of Samaria, who had built a following in Rome, powerful enough to pull an entire Christian community away from the faith, that man was in the air above the most important public space in the ancient world. Peter knelt. He prayed to Jesus. He made a deliberate, specific request. Not that Simon die, not that he fall to his death, but that he fall, that he be struck down and injured, that the flight end, publicly, in front of everyone watching, in a way that left no room for Simon to claim a misunderstanding. The specificity matters. Peter asked for the injury, not the execution. Simon fell. The leg, or thigh, the Acts of Peter's term admits both translations, and Schneemelke notes the ambiguity at page 311, broke in 3 places when he came down. Simon Magus fell from the air over the Via Sacra and landed broken. The crowd that had watched him rise had now watched him fall. He was carried out of the forum, wounded and unable to walk, loaded onto whatever transport could take him south. The Appian Way ran out of Rome toward the southeast. Approximately 26 kilometers down that road was the town of Arixia. That is where they took him. That is where the operation on his broken bones was performed. That is where the Acts of Peter records his death. Not in Rome, not in the Forum, not before the crowd that had watched him fly. In a provincial town on the road south, on a surgical table, from injuries sustained when Peter's prayer brought him down. Simon Magus, the man who had corrupted the Roman community, converted a senator, and stolen a widow's gold, died in Aricia during surgery. Nero was not mourning. The Acts of Peter records the emperor's response as fury at the public embarrassment Simon's collapse had created. Whatever value Simon had represented to the imperial household, whatever credibility, whatever spectacle, whatever political or social influence the imperial court had derived from its association with this wonder-worker, it had ended on the Via Sacra in front of everyone who needed to see it, and the person whose prayer had ended it was still in Rome. Nero's anger found its direction. But Nero was not the only powerful man in Rome who wanted Peter held to account. Something had been happening alongside the contest of signs, running beneath the more visible confrontations. Peter had been teaching, and what Peter taught included the spiritual virtue of complete sexual renunciation, total chastity as a calling for those who wanted to live fully in the Spirit. This was not a minor element of Peter's preaching in the Acts of Peter. It was a central part of what he proclaimed. Agrippa, the prefect of Rome, had 4 concubines. All 4 of them had heard Peter preach. All 4 of them converted to chastity. They decided, on the basis of what Peter taught, that they would no longer return to Agrippa's bed. They refused him. 4 women who had lived under his authority and in his household withdrew that status from him, not through any legal mechanism and not through flight, but simply by saying no. Peter's teaching had reached them, and they had acted on it, and the action they took was to close the door of Agrippa's bedroom to Agrippa. The Acts of Peter, chapters 33 through 35, Schneemelke, pages 311 through 314, records that this conversion directly caused Peter's arrest. Not the resurrection contest, not the flight and fall, the concubines, Agrippa's personal rage, the rage of a man who had lost 4 women who had lived in his house and served his authority, combined with Nero's political outrage over the Via Sacra disaster. Two men, two different flavors of anger, one apostle between them. This episode mattered for what happened to the text itself. An institution that wanted to operate inside the Roman Empire could not officially endorse a text that argued spiritual authority superseded household authority. The concubines were one of the reasons the Acts of Peter had to disappear, and we will come to that full account in time. Peter's arrest was ordered. Peter left in the dark. The Roman Christians who had come to love him had begged him to go. Not because they wanted him gone. They understood what was coming. Agrippa's order had been issued. Nero's anger stood behind it. A man who had humiliated Simon Magus in the Forum and won back the entire crowd, who had converted 4 women out of the prefect's own household, could not stay in the city and expect to walk free. Peter took the Appian Way south, the same road on which Simon Magus had been carried, broken, toward Eryxia. It was night. The gate of the city stood behind him. The road opened into the dark. He had not gone far when he saw a man walking toward Rome. The Acts of Peter, chapter 35, records what happened at the gate. Peter was walking out. The man he saw was walking in. Peter recognized him and stopped. He said, "Lord, where are you going?" Here is the direct text. Here is what the Acts of Peter records as the exchange at the edge of the city, on the road south, in the night. And as Peter went forth of the city, he saw the Lord entering into Rome. And when he saw him, he said, "Lord, whither goest thou?" And the Lord said unto him, "I go into Rome to be crucified." And Peter said unto him, "Lord, art thou being crucified again?" He said unto him, "Yea, Peter, I am being crucified again." And Peter came to himself. He turned around. This is not the first time Peter has fled. The canonical Gospels record that on the night of Jesus' arrest in Jerusalem, Peter denied knowing him. 3 times. Not once, and then stopped. 3 times. He denied him. He fled. Then he returned. The Acts of Peter is not careless about that pattern. The community that wrote this text had read the Gospels. They knew what a running Peter looked like. They knew what a returning Peter looked like. The flight down the Appian Way in the dark is the same motion as the 3 denials in a courtyard in Jerusalem. And the vision at the gate of Rome is the correction. He had run before. He came back before. He is running again. He will come back again. If you have ever heard the phrase, quo vadis, if you have seen it used as a book title, a film title, a church name, or a piece of religious iconography, this is where it comes from. These words, this road. Domine, quo vadis is Latin for, "Lord, where are you going?" It is the exact phrase preserved in the Latin text of the Acts of Peter. A church stands on the Via Appia Antica today, the Appian Way road that still exists outside the walls of Rome, called the Church of Domine Quo Vadis. It was built at the spot where, by tradition, this encounter took place. The scene was considered important enough to be turned into architecture. It entered the memory of Christian Rome as something that actually happened at a specific place, on a specific road, on a specific night. And it comes from a banned book. The Quo Vadis encounter does not appear in the canonical Gospels. It does not appear in the canonical Acts of the Apostles. There is no earlier text in existence that records this scene. According to Wilhelm Schneemelcher, in the standard academic reference for this period at page 313, the Acts of Peter is the first attestation of the Quo Vadis story in any surviving text. The first time anyone wrote down those words was in this book, the book that the institutional church would declare spurious. The book that survived because one Latin codex ended up in a library in northern Italy that no one examined for 14 centuries. Peter turned around and went back to Rome. He was arrested. He was sentenced to crucifixion. He made one request. He asked to be crucified head downward, to die upside down, with his head toward the ground and his feet toward the sky. The reason he gave for this request is preserved in the Acts of Peter, in direct quotation. "I am not worthy to be crucified in the same way as my Lord." Peter did not ask for mercy. He did not ask to be released. He did not ask for a less painful death or a quicker one. He asked for a stranger death, a more unusual one, a more physically demanding one, because he considered himself unworthy to die the way Jesus had died, upright, in the ordinary position, as though the manner of his death could be the same as his Lord's. The image of Peter on an inverted cross is one of the most recognized symbols in the history of Christianity. It appears on the papal seal. It appears in cathedral paintings across 500 years of European religious art. It is called the Cross of St. Peter. It gave its name to churches from one end of the ancient world to the other. 2 billion people have inherited this image, and most of them have no idea where it first appeared in writing. The earliest source for it is the Acts of Peter. Chapters 37 through 39, Schneemelke, pages 315 through 318. Origen of Alexandria, writing in the late 2nd or early 3rd century, references the upside-down crucifixion in a fragment preserved in Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History, Book 3, Chapter 1, verses 2 through 3. Peter was crucified head downward, for he had requested that he might suffer this way. Origen does not cite the Acts of Peter by name. He writes as though the tradition is already known, already settled, already something his readers share. The Acts of Peter is the earliest surviving text that records it. Now Peter is on the cross, upside down, head toward the ground, feet toward the sky. The crowd is there. The execution is proceeding. And what the Acts of Peter records next, in chapters 38 and 39, is not a farewell prayer, not a word of comfort to the people watching. It is a speech, a long, cosmological, theological speech delivered from an inverted cross about what the cross itself means. The world, Peter says from the cross, is inverted. Everything that appears right side up is actually upside down. The first man, the original human being at the foundation of creation, stands in the text's description, with his head toward the earth and his feet toward heaven. Not as a punishment, as an orientation. The true relationship between human beings and God runs in the opposite direction from the way the visible world presents it. The cross in this speech is the boundary between earthly and heavenly reality, between the world as it appears and the world as it is. These ideas are not in the canonical Gospels. They are not in the canonical letters of Paul. They do not appear in the canonical Acts of the Apostles or in Revelation. Schneemelke and subsequent scholars have identified in this speech language and conceptual categories that resemble what would later be called Gnostic cosmology, a framework in which the material world is seen as inverted and oriented away from the divine, and the spiritual world is the true and upright reality. The Acts of Peter was not written as a Gnostic text. The scholarship is clear on this. It was composed from within proto-Orthodox Christianity, from the same tradition that produced the communities Paul and Peter addressed in their canonical letters. But the speech Peter delivers from the cross in chapters 38 and 39 reaches into cosmological territory that the institutional church, as it consolidated its authority through the 3rd and 4th centuries, found increasingly difficult to endorse. A talking dog is strange. A 7-month-old infant with a borrowed voice is strange. A man falling from the sky above the Via Sacra is strange. But a speech from an upside-down cross that reframes the structure of all reality, that repositions the cross itself as a cosmological symbol rather than simply an instrument of execution, was the content that made the men who controlled the manuscripts put down their pens. The next chapter is about what they did instead. The first blow came from the man who wrote the first history of the church. Eusebius of Caesarea was a historian and a theologian, and the tool he used was categorization. In his ecclesiastical history, composed roughly between 313 and 325 AD, he divided the texts circulating in Christian communities into categories. Some were received, some were disputed, and some were notha, spurious, rejected, not to be used as sources or cited as authoritative. The Acts of Peter went into the notha list. His exact words, at Book 3, Chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. As for the book called Acts of Peter, and the gospel bearing his name, and the preaching and the apocalypse as they are called, we know that they have not been handed down to us in the number of Catholic writings, but that none of the church writers, either in ancient times or in our own day, has made use of testimonies drawn from them. None of the church writers has made use of testimonies drawn from them. What that means in practice, the text is not a source. No one should cite it. No one should reproduce it and pass it to the next community. Eusebius was not ordering the physical destruction of any manuscript. He was withdrawing the text's status as something worth transmitting. For a book that survived only by being copied, that was enough. The second blow came from people who loved it. By the end of the 4th century, the Manichaeans had assembled a collection. The Manichaean movement was considered heretical by Orthodox Christians and persecuted accordingly. And by the end of the 4th century, according to Schneemelke, at page 82 of the Standard Academic Reference, the Manichaeans had collected the 5 major apocryphal acts into a single corpus: Peter, Paul, John, Andrew, Thomas. They loved these texts for their endorsement of asceticism and sexual renunciation. Once the Manichaeans adopted the Acts of Peter, Orthodox copyists would not touch it. Association was enough. The third blow was official. The Decretum Gelasianum is a list of accepted and rejected books compiled around 495 AD, traditionally attributed to Pope Gelasius I, though modern scholars identify it as a 6th century South Gallic compilation. In its list of rejected books, the Acts of Peter appears by name. The Latin is 3 words: Actus nomine Petri Apocryphum. The Acts in the name of Peter, apocryphal, 3 condemnations across 2 centuries. The condemnations were not arbitrary. The authorities who rejected this book were acting on specific objections, and those objections tell you more about the early institutional church than any document it produced in its own defense. The first objection was the register: a talking dog, a 7-month-old infant with an adult man's voice, a man rising above the Roman Forum and falling. These were not the kinds of miracles a church-building institutional credibility inside the Roman Empire could officially endorse. A dog preaching in a human voice before a Roman crowd was not the image the institutional church wanted associated with apostolic authority. The second objection was contamination. Once the Manichaeans adopted the Acts of Peter, endorsing the text meant endorsing something a condemned movement endorsed. That association could not be separated from the book itself. The third objection was the most politically explosive. The Acts of Peter says, through the episode of Agrippa's concubines, that spiritual authority supersedes household authority. 4 women who lived under a Roman official's authority heard Peter preach and decided they would no longer return to his bed. Not through legal action, not through flight. They said no. The text presents this as the right thing for them to have done. A church building its presence inside the Roman Empire could not distribute texts that told women in powerful households they had the right to refuse powerful men in the name of God. The concubines were one of the reasons the text had to disappear. The Acts of Peter was not destroyed. There are no records of manuscripts being gathered and thrown into fires. Its disappearance was quieter. It was simply not copied. One Latin codex survived, the Cathedral Chapter Library of Vercelli, in the flat plains of northern Italy, 50 miles east of Turin. One archive, one copy. Still there, but the book left one more fragment behind. In January 1896, a German diplomat named Karl Reinhardt purchased a papyrus manuscript in Cairo. It is now catalogued as Papyrus Berlinensis 8502, the Berlin Codex. Inside it, alongside the Gospel of Mary Magdalene and the Apocryphon of John, was a fragment from the Acts of Peter preserved in Sahidic Coptic, dated to the late 4th or early 5th century. The first full scholarly edition was not published until 1955, when Walter Till produced the Editio Princeps, nearly 60 years after Reinhardt bought it. What the fragment contains is the story of Peter's daughter. Peter had a daughter. She was paralyzed. Peter healed her temporarily and then returned her to paralysis. His explanation was that her condition protected her from being a temptation to men. The Egyptian Christians who copied it in the 4th century kept it alongside the Gospel of Mary Magdalene without apology. Scholars working from the Vercelli text did not know this episode existed until 1955. It sat in Berlin for 60 years before anyone read it. You have now seen what the Acts of Peter actually says. A dog given a human voice to preach Peter's challenge before a Roman crowd. A 7-month-old infant who borrowed an adult's voice to rebuke a magician in a crowded room. A man who rose above the sacred road of Rome and fell. An apostle who fled the city in the dark and turned around because someone was walking the other direction. A request from a man about to die that they flip the cross, because he did not consider himself worthy to die the way his Lord had died. And from that upside-down cross, a speech about the inversion of all reality. Every one of those scenes was first written in this book, not in the Gospels, not in the letters of Paul, not in the canonical Acts of the Apostles, in the Actus Vercellensis, in the banned book, in the single Latin codex at Vercelli, missing 1/3 of its original text, holding the other 2/3, which is more than anyone had reason to expect. That codex is still there, in the same archive, still readable, still incomplete, still the only copy. If this is the kind of history you came here for, subscribe to this channel now and activate the bell. Every week we open another text they condemned. Every week we find what was in the gap. The full study ebook is in the pinned comment below. It covers this text and the others this channel explores in more depth than a video can hold. Download it now. What comes next on this channel is another book they decided you should not read. Stay with me. The next one